Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're pleased that you're able to join us for this 2017 Crisis Coach webinar. This is part of the New Jersey MEP webinar series. They've been our host and co-sponsor for this for a number of years now. Today we're going to be talking about workplace recovery, what to do after a disaster. We'd also like to have you become our friend. Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. You can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach. We follow a predict, plan, perform model. Our attorneys advise us that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. Do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Today we've got Joe Caratanudo with us. He's with the New Jersey MEP, and we also have our very own Blair Neville, who is a principal of Firestorm in the New Jersey area. Joe, over to you for some introductory kind of things, then we'll go to Blair.
Okay, I'm Joe Caratanudo from New Jersey MEP. For those that are not familiar with us, New Jersey MEP focuses on assisting manufacturers to become more productive, more efficient, and more globally competitive in what they do. And for example, we do things like help companies with their energy costs, take advantage of tax credits that are available for them for innovation. We also get involved in process improvement and assisting companies with methodologies like lean manufacturing and Six Sigma. And we also get involved on the compliance end with assisting companies in getting ISO certified and the different standards for the different industries for ISO certification. One of the things we also do is advocate for the manufacturers in the state, and just on Friday we had National Manufacturing Day, where hundreds of manufacturers joined us in Bridgewater for seminars and roundtable discussions on different topics relevant to manufacturing. In addition, it was announced that NJMEP was also integral in helping a manufacturing caucus get organized in New Jersey, where our political leaders are now going to meet periodically to discuss the issues that are important to manufacturing, to ensure that the companies that are here have a voice and are being heard going forward. So some good things happening, and we're pleased to see it. So back to you, Bill.
Thanks. Blair, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Bill, thank you. And as Bill mentioned earlier, I am the principal in the New Jersey area, and I've been working with I've been working with Joe and the MEP for many years, and I just always like to begin the session by thanking them for their efforts. You heard Joe mention all of the things they're involved with, and they've embraced the idea of continuity and preparedness, and have taken it and run with it over the last few years and introduced it to their clients. So we appreciate their support for us and Firestorm, but probably more important, their support for this whole idea of companies becoming more resilient and prepared. So again, I just want to thank them for their time, energy, and support.
Thanks, Blair. We also have with us today Dan Perrin. Dan is Global Solutions Director of the Regis organization, and we're delighted to have him with us. Our main presenter is going to be our very own Karen Mazzullo. I believe Hart is not going to be able to join us. I think he's on another assignment today. Dan and Karen, over to you, please.
Thanks. I'd like to welcome everyone to our session today, and thank you, Bill, Joe, and Blair. I'd like to introduce you to Dan Perrin. Dan's going to give us some great information today about how you can continue to keep the business side of your manufacturing business running during a crisis or a disaster. He's got some very interesting stories about their own continuity of operations that occurred back during Sandy. With that, I'd like to move forward, and Dan, I'm going to be asking you for your input as we go forward. He is the Global Solutions Director for Regis, so anybody on this call, if you'd like to get in touch with Dan or ask any questions, we'll make sure to help put you together. I am the Chief Intelligence Officer for Firestorm, and I have a little bit of a cold today, so if my voice gives out completely, that's why we have a whole bunch of people on the call, because everybody can contribute some great thoughts. Wanted to start out by just sort of teeing up the conversation for everyone on the call. We asked you last year what crisis was going to be the #1 concern for your organization, and we got about, I think we had about 850 responses to this particular question for businesses and schools. And 24% of you said a natural disaster is way up there, only secondary to cyber attacks. Although if you group the school, terrorist, loss of life event together, they're pretty equal. So cyber, violence event, and natural disaster. And for all of us who live on the coast, we have, just as California has unique challenges in their environment, we certainly have our set of unique challenges, everything from ice storms that bring down our power lines, train incidents that make it impossible for our employees to get to work, storms, hurricanes, flooding. We have quite a number of events that can occur. And it's important that we sit down and we go through all of those possibilities and come up with a plan and a program so we can be more resilient for not only our employees and, if we're a public company, our shareholders, but our customers and our vendors and our suppliers, et cetera. So we really want to look at just how robust our business continuity strategy is. And more important, have you tested your plan? Now, this image was, as we know, from Miami, and I still am curious about the wisdom of taking down these cranes. And it's a rather personal visual for me. I have a very dear friend. One of the reasons that I moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where I currently live, is because one of my very best friends had purchased a bed and breakfast on one of our little islands here. And at one point in time when my husband and I were considering a new place to live, we wanted to be near friends, and so that was one of the reasons we came to Charleston. And also, he needed us because about 6 months prior to our making the decision to move, a crane, much like the one you see, although not quite as tall, crashed down during a storm in the middle of his bed and breakfast and destroyed it. And it was 6 years in litigation with the insurance company. And he lost a great deal through that. So how much could your business stand to lose if your employees didn't have a place to return to for 6 years? What would the impacts be for you? So we really want to sit down and look at any natural disaster that may occur or other interruption in business that could keep us from doing the business of doing business. And just take a moment to think about the impact that natural disasters or other really significant business impact incidences have had on businesses just like yours, and then sit down with your teams and say, how would we get back to business? We have wildfires raging on the West Coast right now. Homes are lost. What if those are your employees and they can't work? What if you're ordered to evacuate your facilities? In Hurricane Harvey, we saw facilities that were flooded, and that flooding caused secondary explosions and fires within facilities. Sitting back and knowing that's your facility, Do you have a plan, and are you able to think about what your recovery strategy is going to be? So that sort of tees up our conversation for today. We've seen Harvey, Irma, Maria, Nate this year. We've seen others, small storms. What's next? We have wildfires raging. So Firestorm uses something called a hazard impact matrix. And it's a simple tool for those of you who are smaller businesses or businesses that you're just maturing your program, or for someone who you're looking for a way to be able to plot the hazards in your organization. This impact matrix is a really simple tool to use. And for those of you on the call, Blair Neville is in New Jersey, and you can reach out to Blair and we'll put you in touch with him, and he can provide you with he can sit down with you for about an hour and talk about these tools and others.
Yeah. Karen, just to comment on that, I've done a number of these and done them with Joe's and some of the manufacturers out of the MEP, and they really, the idea of this is two things. One is it really narrows down on which hazards are most important, so that you can deal with mitigants and understand where I want to spend my time. But also in going through the process, it also helps understand the impacts on your business, and that's where a lot of people don't get that information. They understand ice storms and they understand, we have hurricanes and things of that nature. So people can talk about those and talk about their experiences. But where this exercise helps is really understanding the impacts to the business, whether it's a customer or a vendor or, and how do you deal with that? And it's a great exercise to go through.
Blair, those are such important points. That we had a client, this was a bit of a different situation, but Blair, I know I don't think it was one of your contacts, but I know it was a little bit different than a natural disaster, but we sat down with all levels of the organization's leadership, and this is a great exercise for you to do with Blair. But we sat down with the board and said, if flooding completely wiped out your data center, if there was a tornado or something wiped out the data center, and you lost all information, all your backup tapes, everything was gone, how long would it take your IT department to get back up and running? And the board said, we think about 4 to 7 days. We went to senior leadership reporting up to the board, and they said, we think about 7 to 15 days. We went to middle management. Middle management said, I don't know, about 3 weeks. And we went to IT, and IT said we could have bare bones technology back within 4.5 months. That's a big difference in perception of an issue and the time to resolution. So it's a great exercise, and part of this exercise is how much forewarning are you going to have, how long is the duration, and the duration piece is what's important, because it's not just that when the storm ends and, okay, within 3 days, hopefully everything will be back to normal. I think there are a lot of businesses today in Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Florida, and in Texas that will tell you that it is much more of an extended period of time. My husband and I recently took a short trip to one of the islands in South Carolina, and they are still cleaning up from Hurricane Matthew. We went shortly after Irma hit just to help with some cleanup, and there was just some friends and work to be done down there. But they were still cleaning up from Matthew, and that was more than 13 months prior. So we need to be reasonable, and those of you on the East Coast know that after seeing what Hurricane Sandy did. So we have 2 types of damage. We have direct damages, and that's harm to physical structures, your buildings and the belongings inside of them. What you're looking at is an image of the hospital that was just hit when the tornado tore through Joplin. And a friend of Firestorm took these images for us. On the right-hand side is our indirect damages, and those are the damages that can happen to a community, a town, schools, caused by people losing their incomes and jobs, and that trickle through the trickle-through effect of that happening. And we've seen that happen in a significant way all across the country. Dan, I know that you've seen that personally, when a business can't do business, and many businesses can't do businesses, and we've seen small towns and others just start to collapse because of it. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's a significant problem for organizations. I mean, whenever a significant event happens like Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Harvey or Irma, it was interesting with Hurricane Harvey that the initial assessment that organizations were able to do to their facilities was 4 or 5 days out after the initial storm. So when you were talking about that company earlier that said, oh, they think they could do it in 3 or 4 days, initial assessments are happening over the first 3 or 4 days in some natural disasters. And the long-term impact of just getting a hold of your people and having your teams in place, your recovery teams identified, is really a tough thing to do once the event's already taken place.
Especially if people aren't even allowed back in the area.
That's correct.
We may not even know where our people are.
Yeah, and we definitely saw that in Texas and Florida. Florida was better than Texas because Texas had just happened, and companies in Florida were going, oh, yeah, it hasn't been 5 years, it's been 5 days since the last event, right? So for Texas, it's been 5 years since Sandy happened, so people become lackadaisical. There's some distance in between the last natural disaster that happened in North America, so their guard is let down a little bit. And maybe the storm's not going to hit us, right?
Right, that disaster denial, I think disaster denial is our biggest competitor. We've always said that. People just believe it's not going to happen to them.
And then when it happens, what we see from a practitioner side is that we'll get calls. I mean, we received some 3,000 inquiries after Hurricane Sandy for companies that said, we need help, and because they didn't have a plan in place. And we've seen several thousand calls from companies that said, we need help because we didn't have a plan in place. And, the federal government stats on the companies that didn't have a plan in place in New Jersey and in New York, it's 30% of those companies never came back from that, and maybe on a slide down the road, but isn't that 30% is a very high number. Organizations that didn't have a plan never recovered.
And we weren't talking about, little mom and pops, and we were talking about significant businesses that just weren't prepared. I think, too, Dan, is looking at, this is from Hanover Ray for reinsurance purposes, and they put the cost at $3 billion for Harvey alone, and this was early on in the assessments. So we're probably looking at 10 to 20 billion from Harvey, and that's from Harvey alone. But then we have to look at the other things that happen as a result of it. Have you factored in to your recovery plans the idea that fuels of any type may be higher because of a significant issue? And of course, we have to remember it may not just be in your regional facility, but in facilities that affect your regional facility. So if something happens in one part of the country, if we have really a great business continuity team and a great group of planners, they know that we're going to have issues that will trickle over to us as well. We know that there were more than 1 million businesses impacted. We saw air travel woes that are still coming back. We had people, many of you on the call today had people elsewhere, out of the country, away from your main facilities during times of crisis. We know in Harvey and in Irma and others, people, again, they bugged out, and then it took a long time for some folks. Some folks are not back yet. Ground transportation, we have roads that have washed away, bridges that have washed away. So if you're a major port, I was talking to a client yesterday down in Florida, and they were very frustrated because they were trying to get supplies to an affiliate of theirs in Puerto Rico. But the problem was the cranes were damaged at the port, so they can't lift the containers into the ships to transport them. Factoring in those types of crises on top of your crises are really important. And then, of course, we have nutrition challenges and crop damage and higher costs associated with that. So on a very high level, we need to look at the world and what the impacts were going to be, and then what happens to us if not only are all these impacts going on, but then nobody can get to us. So we know
Karen?
from the first, yes.
This is Blair. I just want to make a quick comment on that previous slide. There's one area that it's kind of inherent in all of those. It's inherent in all those issues. I was speaking with somebody. I was speaking actually with a medical group in California yesterday, and it came across. They were struggling obviously with the wildfires that are happening out there, and their biggest concern at the moment, because their main offices are not directly in fires, they have clinics out around in the Northern California area. And the idea of their personnel and communications, it was clear to them that they weren't prepared to deal with this because they had people, they can't get a hold of them. So they don't know where their employees are, and they can't get, and they have no visibility to the clinics. So the amount of time, the amount of energy that's going on right now for them just literally to trying to locate employees is incredibly costly, and then you have that whole emotional toil that goes on behind the scenes. So it's something that the things that you mention are obvious and very important, but through just a lack of the ability to be able to communicate somehow and have a plan around that, that's where they're spending their time right now.
And Blair, even a simple Facebook group for your employees can help with the check-in. Facebook does a I'm safe check-in. You can do you can start that yourselves, internal to your organization. Just so, I remember, Blair, on 911, we had 45 people in the air. 6 of them were on our senior leadership team. We had no idea where they were. Our offices, our key offices were in Boston and New York. We had no idea we didn't know where our CEO was. We didn't know where our CFO was, our CMO, and we had no way of figuring it out. So you make a really great point, and there are so many pieces to this, the nuances to how do you find people and make sure they're safe. And then there's the other side of the coin. What if everyone becomes stranded in your facility? So if you're running 3 shifts and a disaster happens during a shift, whatever the disaster may be, how are you going to care for those people that are on your property? Do you have the ability to feed them? Do you have clean water? Do you have clean water for your manufacturing processes? What do you rely on? Do you have the ability to help if someone becomes injured? and they can't get off your property. So we really need to think through all of those worst case scenarios, and it sounds like doom and gloom, but it's a really critical way that we make sure we've run through the eventuality of the plan so that we can keep people and property safe. Now, I'm going to ask Dan, I'm going to ask you to speak to some of these. Now, it's a little bit different in a manufacturing environment. I've got some tips for manufacturers coming up. But let's talk about office operations. Let's talk about technology, accounting, all of those office operations that go on to support the manufacturing environment. Can you talk a little bit to these next slides for me, Dan?
Sure. So where do staff work in during a disaster? And we're typically talking about knowledge-based workers in this particular slide, not manufacturing, because manufacturing typically you don't have a failover for manufacturing, for many manufacturing environments for those employees. But a lot of firms say, we're going to have our people work from home, and which sounds great, but typically that works best when it's an event that only affects your organization. But when you talk about area-wide disasters, working from home is very difficult, especially for employees that don't do it on a regular basis. And you'll find that in Hurricane Sandy, where everyone in New Jersey knows it was really cold that week, or for 10 days, most of the residential areas didn't have power for an extended period of time. We found that in Hurricane Harvey. People couldn't get a hold of their employees to even tell them that they should be working from home, if they could work from home. Most people couldn't work from home because there was no power at their homes, or their homes they had to evacuate their homes. So it's not, our people are of foremost importance when a disaster happens, but the ability to recover your organization is really critical, and is working at home, hopefully working at home, is that the strategy that's going to keep your organization up and running? If it was, companies like Regis and wouldn't be receiving 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 phone calls at the end of a disaster saying we need help, right? Because if work from home strategy was a great one in an area-wide event, then everyone would employ it, and probably organizations would have a lot more employees working from their homes on a regular basis. But typically, we still at today's age, it's mainly sales folks and people that travel a lot work from home more than your typical, HR departments, legal departments, finance departments. They don't work from home. They work in an office-based environment typically, and most of our call center teams, you'll see, work in an office-based environment.
And for those folks that thought through, for those folks who have thought through alternate supplier or vendors that will give them space, have they actually tested the resiliency of those people is a really important question, isn't it?
It is. We see about 50% of our organizations test on a regular basis. And, while we're always communicating with them and encourage them to, it's still not, as high a number as we would like to see. We would like to see 90 to 100% of organizations testing their plans on an annual basis, at least. But, it's better that they have a plan than not have a plan. It's even better that they test the plan that they have to make sure that it works for them in the way they think it's going to work.
Dan, can you, if I'm a manufacturer and I'm going to, I've contacted Regis to have a relationship with Regis so that if something happens, my accounting people, some of my IT folks, my senior leadership is going to need a place to work, and HR needs a place. How does it work? And can I then bring them in to test how quickly we can get there and get set up?
Yeah, absolutely. So Regis and companies like Regis provide fully furnished turnkey environments where the phones, the internet, computers. With computers, we use ours, or you can bring your own over, depending on what your environment is. It's active and ready to go. So you've had the events happened. You've identified which employees are on your critical recovery team that are critical to your organization. You call up your vendor, Regis or whoever it is, and say, hey, we need to activate our plan. We determine which location is best for you to go to for your recovery. With the offices are set up, we give you the keys, we'll give you the the card keys, so you can come and go your teams can come and go as they would at their normal work environment, and continue operations.
And the one thing that I learned from you that I think is really fascinating is we have issues where we thought we had a recovery site set up, but as you mentioned, geographically, it was affected too. We thought we had a recovery site set up, but once we tested it, it was way too small. And once we tested it is the key word there, because if you try to relocate to your recovery site and you haven't tested it, you have no idea if it's actually going to fit your needs, or the recovery site is actually too far away. And because of transportation issues during a natural disaster, our people can't get to the secondary site or to the recovery site at all. Now, I have worked with companies that have actually arranged transportation. They rented buses. They were able to somehow make that work, but that took a lot of planning, and I really admire that they had thought through it in that way. I also think something that's important that I had not really thought of, and I may touch again on this in a bit. I work from home, and my team has been remote for many, many years. I've been a remote employee for almost 20 years. But that takes for granted a lot of things that I know how to do working from my home. It also means that as a company, you may have a virtual private network set up, because security becomes a key concern when suddenly you have people working on unprotected connections from their home. Those of us who are used to working remotely have a higher level of security or a higher level of security awareness. And so prior to doing that, prior to saying to some of your workforce, okay, we think you folks can work at home, you have to look at, can we set up a VPN? How can we educate our phone connections? How can we make sure that they don't have open network connections, open Wi-Fi connections at their homes? So just some of those educational pieces are very important.
Karen?
So, yes, please.
No, I was just going to say that, and again, from kind of from an MEP perspective, a large number of the MEP accounts and the manufacturers, especially in New Jersey, and probably goes in most states, are fairly smaller companies. There's a large amount, which again, they don't have tons of IT resources. They don't have a lot of people to support. They're dealing with production and getting their products out. One of the things I've seen is that a lot of these companies now are going to the cloud. Their servers are supported by companies that do that. So if their building is damaged, they still have access to their inventory, their customer service, their invoicing, HR systems, except most of the people who do it, and you might count that number in 5, 6, 12 people in a business that deal with those things, they're not used to working from home. They may not have the power. They may not have the computers. Their computers are in the building. Having a place to go and work collaboratively together. That's the other thing too. Is if you have 12 people spread around the local area, all working from their homes, it's hard to do the work. So this kind of a service capability appeals to that kind of an account where they're saying we don't need to have a lot of support. We have someone who can support us. We have power, electricity, we have computers, and we can get in and get online. And although we may not be running our business totally, we're at least dealing with clients and vendors and the banks and you know, and employee issues. So for those smaller to medium-sized companies that don't have a ton of resource, again, this model fits very well.
I think so too. You know, we're not talking about moving 1,000 people. Although in some cases we recognize there are manufacturers who have those challenges as well. And let's talk to this, Blair. Can you see the slide in front of you that says points to consider?
I'm sorry, I keep putting you on mute. I keep putting you on mute.
Blair, can you see the points to consider slide?
Yes, I can. Yes.
If you would, let's go ahead and we have 2 slides that cover some of these points. Let's go ahead and take 4 minutes. If you would, why don't you go ahead and roll through these for me, because you know your manufacturers on the East Coast so well. And let's talk just really quickly about each of these points. About 2 minutes on this.
Sure. Let me kind of go through these. And all these are big things. If you're building a plan, and you're putting together a continuity and recovery model, I mean, these are key areas. I've worked with some of the clients to say, hey, can we shift production from one location to another? It's great if you have a sister company, and it's great if you can rely on someone who's in a similar business, who might have excess capacity, those kind of things. Again, tough, has to be planned for, and has to be planned very diligently for. It's possible to do that, but again, without any kind of a plan and without any kind of a relationship and process put in place, it's going to be very difficult to do. And again, moving from one facility to the other, even as simple as just saying, hey, I've got inventory, or I've got shipments coming into one facility, I'm going to move it to another. If you don't have somebody responsible for that, if you don't have a procedure in place, very difficult to do, especially if phone lines are down, if you don't have access to your information. So all of these things start to come back to that point of they're doable and they make sense for some manufacturers, unless you're doing a very, very specific or unique production or have a very specific or unique piece of equipment. But at the same time, if you don't put your plans in place and you don't have people responsible for it, and again, something I mentioned before, if you don't have a communications process in place, how do you get these things done? And again, when we look at being able to respond to a crisis and being able to look at inventory, reallocate it, stop shipments, move them to another facility, again, sounds great and it's doable. We worked with one account where we went through that, and they looked at their inventory was very time sensitive, so they essentially it had to be frozen. So if it's coming into their facility, it can't sit on a loading dock for an extra day or two because of the fact that they have no electricity and no freezer space. So they had to have a plan in place to be able to reallocate very quickly. Again, larger business, they have the capability to handle it, but they didn't have any plan in place. So being able to look at that environment, being able to put the controls in place, have the control points, and more importantly, the triggers, so to know when X happens, here's what we do. That's part of that plan.
And I think putting the resources measured to it are really important. Not only, so we know we have a backup facility, but is it going to be ready when we need it? Mm-hmm. How much time then does it take us to shift production from one either product or location to another? How much in resources is it going to cost to shift production? We need to measure those things so that we do know it's not business as usual, it's business as highly unusual. How much?
And Karen, even if you can do this, if you're spending your time trying to locate your employees,
that's very true, of course, sure.
Even if you have great plans in place, if you don't have the communication and people cannot get access to the information they need, then it's not going to happen. So much of this comes back to that communications piece and the fact that these plans are doable, and to build your recovery plans around these points, especially from a manufacturing point of view, where inventory or client or production can be moved, and it's not easy, but it's not impossible. Without the communications, without the plans in place, it's almost impossible to sort of pull the trigger and get it done.
It's a really great point. I mean, the bottom line is it's really about people, and it requires that you predict, plan, perform. We want you to classify your critical vulnerabilities, and as Blair has mentioned, identify your key emergency personnel, figure out your critical decision processes, analyze the gaps, do your own little SWOT analysis, identify your infrastructure and supply chain needs, and let's make sure we're looking at our suppliers as well, and absolutely define the communication requirements. When you're planning and you develop the strategy, you construct the plan, and then again, you have the critical appropriate personnel to assure that they are buying in and that you have their commitment. And please remember too, folks, when you have staff turnover, you've got to onboard your new folks into the plan phase so that you don't have suddenly a gap. Oh, well, John used to do such and such, and John's not here anymore. Your perform phase is going to establish the protocols then for implementation. How is the community involved, especially if it's a geographic issue? Again, communications is in every piece of this. Testing, auditing, reviewing, updating, and compliance. We've talked about remote working, and you can talk to Blair about this. There are some key points to consider for safety, both of technology and of your people as well. The impact on a loss from everything from your employees don't have water to they don't have a way to communicate and you don't know where they are. But next, just before we close up today and give you your day back, I've given some recovery checklists here that are courtesy of Regis, and at the end of this session, there's a paper on the Regis website, and Regis is really easy to find. It's regis.com. And there's a resource tab, and they've got some really great resources there that you can download as PDF. And some of these checklists are directly from there. And they really help you understand what the right location could be for your organization, and budget and size. It also talks about what are the staff requirements that you're going to have. So if you're a small manufacturing facility, and there's only 13 people that you need directly to be able to access computers and technologies and phones, because somebody's got to follow up with customers and suppliers and vendors, maybe your accounts payable, accounts receivable folks. You can do this very quickly through these checklists and then sit down with your teams and talk about how you're going to work through these alternate work site recovery plans. You can also outline your technology requirements and then any regulatory requirements that you may possibly have. And they've got some great checklists on what to look for your organization and your type. Dan, do you have any last comments that you'd like to make about this? And I'd like to thank you, Dan, for not only attending with us today, but you all offered free access to businesses that were displaced by Harvey. And I wonder if you could just talk really quickly about that. It was very magnanimous, and people needed to sit down and work on their laptops and work on their and charge up their phones, and y'all provided that space for people to be able to do that.
Sure, and you know, it's interesting. It's not just in the locations where the event happened, not just in Houston. So if you think about it, there's probably a lot of employees that were trying to get back to Houston that couldn't get back to Houston right away, and they needed a place to work. So we allowed them to come into our space and just that touch base or keep the organization running. It's nice to have a place to do that, especially when you're not at home and your family's at home, and just getting some type of continuity in your personal life. So we were able to support that. One thing I also wanted to say was that not every employee is critical on the first day from a recovery standpoint. So because you have 50 employees in your company doesn't mean that you have to have 50 places for them to work on day one. You need to figure out who are critical to keep my organization operational. And that might be 10 people or 15 people, like Karen said earlier. So what's really important is that those critical employees know where they're going, what they're doing, and how they're going to do it. On the East Coast, we had the main impacts are hurricanes or storms. So we have some headway as far as 3 or 4 days ahead of time. We know that that's going to happen, so we'll prepare for that better than, let's say, on the West Coast, where I think, Karen, you talked earlier about sheltering in place. They do a really good job on the West Coast about preparing for that and having the water and the food in their facilities, because they know that an earthquake's going to happen someday. They don't know when it's going to happen. So they prepare for that a little bit better than we probably do in the Midwest and then the East Coast.
Well, I really appreciate your input in today. Also, Joe Caratanudo from NJMEP and Blair Neville from Firestorm. There is a paper, as I mentioned, on the Regis website that contains the checklist and some other information that I think you might find very helpful. You can go to regis.com/workplace recovery, and then under resources you'll find that. Firestorm as well will have a transcript of this session with the images used in the slides available to you sometime next week once we have it transcribed. And you'll be able to download the brief and reach out and ask any questions if you'd like to via the contact form on our website. Again, I'd like to thank the New Jersey Manufacturing Exchange Program and Joe Caratanudo for supporting us as we go forward into 2018 as well. And our thanks to you. If you have any questions, please contact us at firestorm.com, webinars at firestorm.com, or our 1-800 number. Meanwhile, thank you, Dan, for being our guest today. Thank you, Bill, for moderating. And thank you, everyone who's on the call, for joining today. That will end our call for today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.